other problems do we need to solve to enable real-world sequential decision-making? Reinforcement learning deals with the problem of maximizing rewards. So it assumes that it can interact with a system, receives ground truth reward supervision, although not ground truth outputs, and then has to figure out the right outputs, the right actions to take to maximize those rewards. But this is not the only problem that matters for sequential decision-making. More advanced topics, which we'll cover in this course, will include things like learning reward functions from examples, which is called inverse reinforcement learning, transferring knowledge between different domains. This is sometimes called transfer learning or meta learning, and it deals with the question of how do you use past experience for different but related tasks to solve new tasks that you haven't been able to solve before. Learning to predict and using prediction to act. This is often referred to as model-based reinforcement learning, where instead of learning behaviors directly, instead what you attempt to learn is some representation of how the world works, which can then be used for planning or for synthesizing into a policy. Here's one question that we'll deal with in the second half of the course. Where do rewards come from? In some cases, it seems very natural. For that grasping robot that we talked about at the beginning, its reward clearly should depend on whether it grasps something successfully. If you're training a dog, some trick, maybe the dog's reward function depends on the treat that it gets. But more generally, where do they come from? If you're learning an Atari game, maybe the answer is obvious. But what if you need a robot to learn to pour a glass of water? This is something that any child could probably do, but for a robot, you would need an entire perception system just to understand whether the water has been poured into the glass correctly. There was a paper that some of my colleagues at the Berkeley AI Research Lab put out a few years back, and in their paper they had this comment at the end: as human agents, we're accustomed to operating with rewards that are so sparse that we only experience them once or twice in a lifetime, if at all. And of course, somebody on Reddit responded to this by saying, I pity the author. But while somewhat tragic, this statement does reflect a lot of tasks that we really do have to solve in the real world. Those of you that are taking this class now, one might say that you're taking this class because you will receive some delayed reward later down the line when you graduate with a degree in computer science. But you can't possibly have learned to receive degrees in computer science from trial and error, because that's probably only something you're going to do once in your lifetime. We know in the brain that there are structures that are responsible for reward mechanisms like the basal ganglia, and these are complex structures. So the rewards in the brain are not these simple switches that you get for very specific and very simple events. There is a lot of brain machinery that is responsible for assigning appropriate rewards to appropriate behaviors. And it's not difficult to see why this is necessary. Besides the examples with college degrees, you could imagine a more naturalistic example, like a cheetah trying to chase down a gazelle. Well, it seems pretty unlikely that the cheetah just randomly flails around until it accidentally manages to maul a gazelle, and from that figures out that because it received a reward, it should do that behavior more often. This behavior is so difficult for the cheetah to perform, there must be some more sophisticated, more detailed guiding mechanism that caused it to acquire this behavior. So are there other forms of supervision besides these kind of very sparse, very occasional rewards? Well, you could imagine acquiring some representation of behavior from demonstrations, either by directly copying the behavior that you observed, or by inferring from that behavior a more detailed reward function, which is called inverse reinforcement learning. So perhaps the cheetah saw an older, more experienced cheetah chasing down a gazelle and figured out from watching that that there are some rewarding behaviors that can happen down the line. You could also learn from observing what happens in the world. So you could, for instance, learn to predict future events. If you learn something about the causal structure, about the physics of the real world, then you can use that knowledge, that learned knowledge, to figure out which actions will lead to desired outcomes. Unsupervised learning methods take care of part of this problem. You could also learn from other tasks. So maybe you haven't solved this particular task at hand, maybe you've never obtained a degree in computer science before, but you've performed other tasks that are structurally related. You went to high school perhaps, where you obtained a high school degree, and from that you've understood something about the structure of how you get education, how you pass tests, and so on. This is sometimes referred to as transfer learning. A more sophisticated version is called meta-learning, which actually uses past tasks not just to become better at new tasks, but to actually become better at acquiring new tasks, actually learning how to learn. And this is hopefully something that you've all done through past classes that you've taken. Methods in these categories have been shown to do some pretty impressive things. So this is a video released by NVIDIA about 4 years ago showing an imitation learning system for autonomous driving. So this is not a reinforcement learning system. It doesn't learn from reward supervision. It actually learns by attempting to mimic human drivers. And we'll talk about imitation learning in a lot of detail next week. But observing other agents performing useful behaviors can be used for more than just direct mimicry, direct imitation. This is a video showing an experiment in child psychology. So here this guy is trying to put some books away, and this child is going to watch what he's doing. Now the child is not going to mimic this person. What the child is going to do instead is infer what this person is trying to do, and then perform the task that they are attempting to do, but more optimally. So if you can observe somebody doing something and figure out their goal, perhaps you can actually accomplish their goal more effectively by performing a little bit of reinforcement learning with that inferred goal. And of course, we can turn this into real-world algorithms. So here, this is an experiment done by Chelsea Finn. Chelsea is demonstrating to the robot a behavior for pouring from one cup into another. And the robot is not just going to copy this behavior. What it's going to do is it's going to infer its goal, which is to position the orange cup over the yellow cup, and then pour into a cup at a different location. The way that it does the physical pouring might be a little bit different, but the goal will be the same. Prediction. Prediction is a pretty fundamental component of human and animal control and decision making. There's a quote says that the idea that we predict the consequences of our motor commands has emerged as an important theoretical concept in all aspects of sensory motor control. Prediction for real-world control is something that is studied in the domain of model-based reinforcement learning. So here's an example from some work by Frederick Ebert, who's a student here at UC Berkeley. Here we have a robot that is interacting with objects in its environment, and it's not interacting very purposefully. It's sort of playing with objects, just kind of moving around, randomly pushing things around. And that experience is going to be used not to learn a policy for doing any particular thing, but instead to learn a model that predicts what will happen next, given what the robot is seeing now and what action it's considering taking in the future. So each row in this illustration starts from the same starting image, but predicts the outcome for different actions. And this particular model is directly predicting the pixels that the robot will see. So it's predicting that if in the top row, if the robot arm moves up, those are the pixels. If it moves down, the pixels are different, and so on. And of course, as you can see in the bottom row, it correctly predicts that if the arm moves to the right, then it will also push some objects. Now the predictions are kind of blurry, they're quite uncertain, but they capture some basic properties about how objects will behave. And then we can give the robot a goal. We can tell it, take this object located at this red dot and move it to the position of this green dot. And by directly predicting the outcomes of its actions, the robot can plan out a series of actions that will move the object in the right way. And here is the result of actually executing that behavior. We could use predictive models for more sophisticated behaviors. This is work by Annie Shi, who was an undergraduate here at Berkeley. And what Annie did is extended the system to use a predictive model to plan how to use tools. So here a robot could plan to pick up a sponge and use that sponge to move some objects. It could pick up a little hook and use that hook to move this blue object to the top. And it could even improvise by figuring out that it can use a water bottle to sweep some trash to the edge of the bin. We can also use predictive models for other tasks. So this is some work by Kaiser et al., which focused on using predictive models to play video games. So here in the left, you see the predictions made by the model for this particular video game, and in the middle, you can see the real images. The image on the right just shows the difference between the two. The predictions are not actually perfectly correct. So here, for instance, the real image had 3 opponents, the predicted one had only 1, but they're kind of qualitatively right. So the model predicts that when you kick the opponents, they'll disappear, and that you'll get like variable numbers of opponents coming at you. But of course, it's not perfect, so sometimes it has a few issues. In this case, you have this example for a boxing game. The video will repeat shortly. In this boxing game, there are 2 boxers, but they start getting blurry, and then this kind of second boxer appears. and that second boxer then grows a third arm. So there's something very strange going on here, something a little bit unusual. Basically, the model is generalizing in ways that are, a little bit off.